Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to my train room. I'm starting a new series with this episode on building a layout. And I'm going to cover all aspects. I'm going to start with, more conceptual episodes about ideas and planning. And then later on, we'll get into more hands-on stuff when I actually start building stuff in here. As you can see, the room is still a bit of a construction zone. So before I can start really building a layout, I have to finish the room. So that's kind of an ongoing process. Anyway, as far as building the layout itself goes, one of the big fundamental questions before you can really start is, what do I want to model? Or, how do I choose a prototype? And, for myself, I kind of thought that was a no-brainer. And maybe some of you think the same, because I've been modeling Southern Pacific and Santa Fe in the 1990s, since the 1990s. I've got all this equipment and even some other stuff like Conrail engines, because SP was leasing some Conrail in the 90s, so they would have maybe been seen once in a while. And Rio Grande Power, because SP and Rio Grande were merged at that point, and some other stuff. But it all kind of, for the most part, it all fits into that era really nicely. But I can remember when I first got this space and walked in here, I was like, now what? Because I realized that even though I had been modeling equipment that fit into that time period for a long time, I really hadn't given a lot of thought to the actual layout. What do I want to model? What part of the SP do I want to model? It was like I hadn't really thought about it. So, it really surprised me that it was that much of a question. And I know like maybe some people like to draw track plans, and drawing track plans can be kind of a hobby into itself, but I'm not the type that draws track plans unless I have a space to build something. So I didn't want to draw track plans for a room that didn't exist, because it's great to plan that dream 50 by 100 foot train layout, and when you win the lotto, but if you can never build it, then it's like, well, maybe if you really like drawing track plans, that's fun, but otherwise it's kind of like, well, what was that about? So I hadn't really done that. And then I was thinking about it too, some other people, maybe you don't have a favorite railroad. Maybe you have a favorite something else, like maybe you like a certain type of scenery, maybe you like the coastline with the ocean, or maybe you like mountains, or maybe you like farmland, there's all kinds of possibilities, or maybe you like certain types of industries. Maybe you really want to model a coal mine, or an automobile plant or something. There's all kinds of things, or maybe you like a certain type of operation, like maybe you're really into mainline operation on a single track railroad where trains take the siding and meet other trains going the opposite way, or maybe you really like switching cars, or switching cars in a yard, or hustling engines around a roundhouse or something. There's all kinds of possibilities. So I would say, as you're thinking about what do I want to model, one of the big questions to ask yourself is, what is it that you really like about trains? I mean, is there something that really excites you about trains? Do you like all trains, or do you really like a certain kind of train? Like some people may really like steam engines because they have all those moving parts that are neat to watch when they're going down the track. Or maybe you like heavy mainline electrics. Maybe you like diesels, or trolleys, or who knows, narrow gauge. Anything. There's all kinds of possibilities, and just think about the things that excite you about the hobby. And another thing I want to suggest, it probably goes without saying, but this is a hobby, it's a pastime, it's supposed to be enjoyable. So make sure to do the thing you want to do. Don't try to build a layout to please somebody else, or and don't get discouraged from doing something just because maybe you think that some guy at the train club isn't going to like it, or whatever. Who cares? You're the one who has to build the layout, and you're the one who has to enjoy it. So build it for yourself. It's a hobby, and there's not much at stake except maybe some leisure time and some spending money. It's not like brain surgery or flying an airplane where if you do it badly people could die. Generally speaking, model railroading is not really that hazardous. So just have fun with it, and just think about the things you like. Before we go too far, I want to talk about a couple of terms. I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. One of those terms is prototype. Because the word prototype can mean different things in different contexts. In the world of model railroading, prototype just means the real thing. This is Union Pacific 1983, which is an SD-70 Ace locomotive that I photographed at the Western Pacific Railroad Museum in Portola in 2005. And then I saw it again at Ketty in 2009. And that's a full-size locomotive. It's the real thing. I got to go in it. They had a little tour. And, it's a real locomotive. So that's, in the model railroading world, that's a prototype. This is a model of that same locomotive. This is an HO scale model by Athearn. And it's a very accurate model. It's got all the details in the right places. The paint job's pretty accurate. So we say the model is prototypical because it looks like the real thing, just smaller. And that's pretty much what a scale model is. It's just a shrunken down version of something in the real world that's built to a specific scale. So the word prototype doesn't just apply to equipment. It can also apply to structures, scenery, and even operation. I've even heard jokes that some people who are really into operation could just have little wood blocks with trucks and couplers on them, and as long as they had reporting marks and they could be operated in a prototypical way, they wouldn't care. I don't know how true that is. Personally, I like my equipment to be a little more realistic looking, but whatever you like is fine. But it's just important to remember that the word prototype can apply to lots of stuff besides just the trains themselves. And then the counterpart to prototype is freelance. And freelance is another word that has a lot of different meanings in different contexts. In the world of model railroading, freelance or freelancing just means that you're taking some artistic license with reality, or you're modeling reality with some fictional elements. Like, for example, maybe you've created your own fictitious railroad, or maybe you've created a fictitious town, or something of that nature. Most of us don't do what I would consider to be pure freelancing, which would be to basically like create a fantasy world with places that didn't really exist, and make trains that are like no trains anyone's ever seen before, and operate them in some crazy way that's never been done. That isn't really what most people do. Most people will take an off-the-shelf model and maybe decal it for their fictitious railroad, which is kind of what I did with this Bachmann Shay. This is one of my large-scale shays, and it's lettered for a fictitious railroad, and it's got some details on it. So even though this shay doesn't represent any particular real locomotive, it's typical enough that it looks right. And that's really what a lot of us do with freelancing when we do freelancing, is we're just trying to create something that looks believable, but maybe has some fictional elements. Kind of like, a novel may be set in the real world, and it's a very believable story, but the characters are fictitious. So it's kind of like that. And the important thing I think to remember is that prototype and freelance are not two diametrically opposed things. It's more of a continuum. It's more like, how much of one or the other are you doing on a scale? And it doesn't just apply to one thing either. Like I said, prototype and freelance can apply to locations, they can apply to scenery, they can apply to industries, they can apply to operation. So you can mix and match. You could have prototype equipment running through a fictitious location that's operated in a prototypical way. So it's kind of like, where do you fit on the spectrum in each of those categories? In recent years, there's been a lot of emphasis, especially in the hobby press, that kind of pushes people more in the prototype modeling direction. And that's great if that's what you want to do, but you don't have to do that. I've seen people having a blast on 3-rail Lionel layouts with, blinking lights and animated buildings and trains running around at breakneck speeds, and nothing bears any resemblance to any real place I've ever seen, but nobody cares because they're having a great time doing it. If you want to build something that's just about having fun with trains, that's fine too. And another thing that's important is that not choosing a prototype is a perfectly valid choice. Maybe you're just one of those people who just likes trains from everywhere and every era, and you just want to run them all together and have fun with it. Okay. Don't let anybody tell you that you shouldn't be doing that, is kind of what I'm getting at. If, that's what you like, great. Now, if you are one of those people who wants to be more prototype based and you want to do the research and take the time and all that to, recreate a specific rail line at a specific time, great. That's awesome too. And that's kind of more where I'm at. But, I'm just saying that there's no right or wrong answers. There's just, different approaches for different people. So this series is mostly about building layouts, but I realize that there are some modelers out there who either by choice or by circumstance don't have a layout. If you're more of a collector, then it's really just about what you like to collect. Some people like to collect, brass steam locomotives. Some people like to collect equipment from a certain railroad. But your choice of what prototype to model is kind of really just that simple. It's whatever you like. If you're operating at a club or on a friend's layout, then you might want to let that kind of determine what you're doing. Maybe the club has a theme, like Chicago Northwestern in 1950s Illinois, or whatever the theme is. You might want to buy equipment that fits into that so that you can participate in their official operating sessions. And I realize a lot of clubs have kind of an anything goes attitude, at least on some nights, but I know there are certain clubs that, at least on their official operating nights, they're very specific and focused about what they're doing. So, if you're participating in that kind of club and you want to really participate in those official operating sessions with your own trains, then you probably should buy stuff that fits in with that. So let's talk about some practical considerations. One of the most important is space. Any model railroad is going to take up a certain amount of square footage, and it has to live somewhere. Now, whether you have a fairly generous space like I do, or you have a small space, you can build an interesting model railroad. You just kind of have to adjust your expectations to the space you have available. One of the things about real railroads is that they're huge. You can take any piece of equipment, even something like a Union Pacific big boy, and shrink it down to HO scale or N scale or even O scale, and it's still a manageable size. It's still something you can pick up and carry around and fit inside your room. You can't take a 100-mile long railroad subdivision and shrink that down into something that's going to fit inside your room, doing it foot for foot. It's just not possible. So one of the other terms you may have heard is selective compression, and that's basically the idea that when you're modeling a railroad, which takes up miles and miles of real estate, you're going to have to probably shrink it down and condense things so that maybe the distances between towns aren't as long as they are in the real world, or maybe the towns themselves aren't as big as they are in the real world. And those, that's just kind of one of the things that we have to do as model railroaders. For example, in this room, I've got, about 33 usable layout feet in the long way down here. There's actually 36 feet about in the room, but I'm saving about 3 feet for an aisleway pass through, because this train room is actually the center of the building, and there's going to be a game room on one side and a garage on the other, and I want people to be able to get back and forth. And then I've got about 19 feet of width. So my practical layout space is about 33 feet by 19 feet. And I've done some rudimentary track planning just to kind of get an idea of what kind of a layout shape I might use. I'm not doing anything detailed yet, just kind of a main line and then bench work outlines to just kind of figure out how big things can be. And I have some design criteria going on, like aisle widths and things like that, which I don't want to talk about too much right now because that gets into track planning, and that's a whole nother topic. But basically, in this room, if I confine myself to a single deck and I have a layout that's scenically pure, which if you haven't heard that one, it means that the track runs through the scene once and then goes away. It doesn't come back and loop over itself, because those kind of situations are rare in the real world. Like Tehachapi Loop is kind of a novelty because you don't see that every day. Most places the track comes from one direction, goes through town and leaves in the other direction, and that's it. So to have a scenically pure plan on one deck, no matter how I wrap it around the room, tends to come out to about 120 to 130 feet of mainline run. Now in HO scale, a scale mile is 60 feet, more or less. So that means that my visible mainline is about 2 scale miles. So my options for that kind of a space would be, I could model 2 miles of a main line, like a 2-mile stretch of somewhere on the SP. I could model a 2-mile industrial lead. I could model a 2-mile short line. And any of those options would allow me to do it pretty much foot for foot accurate. But if I want to do anything bigger than that, if I want to model, say, 30 or 40 miles of railroad, then I will have to selectively compress what I'm doing. There's just no way around it. So selective compression is just one of those things that we have to deal with as model railroaders, whether we're hardcore prototype modelers or freelancers or what have you. If you have a small space, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have something interesting. You can model a switching layout, which is always a good option for small spaces. You can go down to a smaller scale because, for example, if you switch from HO to N, you can get twice as much basically in the same amount of square footage. Or you can, another thing that works really well is to do like a single location layout. This is a little plan that I designed that never got built, but for basically 2 5-foot long modules stuck together, and you could put a staging yard on one or both ends, and then you could, have a lot of switching opportunities. Plus, you could have through trains going from, one staging yard to the other. So it's definitely important to think about the space that you have before you start building or planning a layout. One of the other important practical considerations is time. And I don't mean the era that you're planning to model, but how much time you have to devote to the hobby. All of us have other demands on our lives, work, family, pets, mowing the lawn, maybe working on your house. None of us can be model railroaders 24 hours a day. So you have to figure out, how much time you can realistically spend doing your hobby and then kind of plan accordingly. So even if you have a huge space, if you don't have a lot of time, you might not want to try to build an entire layout to fill that space all at once. One of the things I've seen suggested before, and it's kind of a good idea, is to build things in sections. If you want to design a big layout, fine, but then try to design it so that it could be built in phases. And maybe each phase could be a short, maybe 6 to 8 foot long section. And you could build that and really focus on it, detail it, finish it, and maybe stick like an unscenic staging yard on one or both ends. So it's almost like the single location kind of idea for a small space. And then just, enjoy that while you're building the next section. And then you can put the next section together and move the temporary staging yard to the end and just keep adding on to it. I think that's a really good approach if you don't have a lot of time to just jump in with both feet. Because, one of the things you don't want is to end up with this huge thing that's just so overwhelming that you don't even want to walk into your train room. I can remember, I don't remember which magazine it was in, but quite a few years ago I saw this cartoon of this kind of dilapidated, half-finished benchwork with cobwebs on it and little pieces of track hanging off. And the caption was something like, many beginners make the mistake of trying to do too much too soon. Only I think I would amend that to say, not just beginners, but anybody. If you, it's fairly easy to build benchwork. It's harder to, finish the layout. So, you just want to be careful you don't get overwhelmed by the scope of the project and then, quit the hobby or give up on it and tear it down, or, have your significant other, be after you because you haven't touched it in 3 years, and why don't you tear it down so that, they can use the space for something else or whatever. So, just really important to keep your time in mind when you're, thinking about doing the hobby. And that's especially important if you plan to be a prototype modeler who does a lot of meticulous research and trying to get every last detail historically correct, because you're going to have to spend a lot of time just poring over books, looking at things online, et cetera. Because, one of the things that's kind of harder about modeling a town versus, say, modeling a locomotive is that most locomotives are standardized, especially diesels. They're built to, standard design. So, one railroad's GP35 is much like another's. Yes, they have different details and paint jobs, but, the basic engine is the same. And all of those detail parts are generally available so that if you want to do that kind of stuff, you can do it. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's possible. But if you look at a town, almost every building in every town is unique. I mean, unless you're modeling like a Taco Bell or something that is built to some standard design, generally, every town is going to have unique buildings, and chances are you're not going to be able to find a kit that's exactly like all the buildings in whatever town you're trying to model. So you got to kind of think about that. do I want to do this board for board accurate? Because if you do and you have a sizable town, that can take a long time. So the more of a prototype modeler you want to be, the more time you're going to have to spend doing research and taking measurements and that kind of stuff. I'm not trying to discourage anyone, but it's important to keep that in mind that that kind of goes with the territory. One way around that, if you want to keep a prototypical flavor, but maybe not go to quite so much work, I have a couple ideas. One, if you have a particular town that you're trying to model, one way would be to go to that town or find photos of that town and identify the 4 or 5 key structures in that town that kind of make that town look like that town. So that people who see it would say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so USA. And maybe take the time to model those 4 or 5 structures as accurately as you can. And then maybe if there's some storefronts and things that kind of are a little more generic looking, you could use kits for those. And so, if you did it right, the end result would look convincing enough that it would probably be an effective model. Another option is to create a fictitious town on a real rail line. You could take, for example, maybe you want to model a certain stretch of rail line somewhere, and there's aspects of 3 or 4 towns along that line that you like. Maybe one has an interesting industry, and maybe one has an interesting depot, and another one has an interesting track arrangement, but you can't find all of that stuff in the same place. Well, one of the things you could do is to create a fictitious town and take all of those elements that you like and combine them together into one place. And then you could use kits and either kit bash them or paint them so that they are in keeping with the general architectural style of the region. And you probably, again, have a very effective model. So even though the town isn't really a real town, it looks convincing enough that it doesn't blow the realism of the layout. So those are a couple ideas for, if you want to be a little more realistic, but maybe don't want to go to all the research and everything that you need to do to be a hardcore prototype modeler. So one of the other important practicalities of doing a model railroad is budget. And that's something we all have to deal with, and we all have different levels of money available to devote to the hobby. And I've kind of been on both sides of the spectrum. At this point in my life, I'm fortunate enough that I can, pretty much support my hobby and not worry too much about what I'm spending. But that hasn't always been the case. Many times in my life, I've been on a pretty tight budget, and I've still managed to do some modeling. One of the things I used to do, and still do from time to time, is go through my collection of equipment that I've accumulated over the years and get on eBay or whatever and sell off stuff that I don't want anymore or don't think really fits into what I'm trying to do. That's one way of generating a little bit of money to maybe devote to something you do want or need. I used to, and I don't know if this is still a viable thing to do because I haven't done it in a long time, but I used to weather freight cars and sell them on eBay. I'd like buy a freight car and weather it and sometimes tag it up with graffiti and then sell it on eBay for 3 or 4 times what I bought it for. And then I would use that money to buy trains that I wanted. So that's an option. You can do things like that to kind of help generate some income for your hobby. Another thing to do is to kind of emphasize quality over quantity. I really think, and I would give this advice to beginners too, you're a lot better off having one really good locomotive and a few really good freight cars than going to a flea market and getting 10 junky locomotives and 200 junky freight cars. The quality equipment will run much better and will be a lot more satisfying to use than a bunch of junk will. At least that's in my opinion. Nothing is an interest killer in this hobby more than I think equipment that doesn't run well or layouts that don't run well. That's one of the reasons I'm so fussy about stuff like coupler height and all that. It all kind of funnels into this idea that a layout should run, every track should work, and there shouldn't be any derailments. And that's not always 100% achievable, but you can get close if you work at it. So I would really emphasize, quality over quantity. And sometimes it's just a matter of deciding that, instead of buying yet another sound-equipped, engine, I'm going to go to the lumber yard and buy some wood so I can start making bench work. You know, a couple of sound-equipped engines will finance quite a bit of lumber. So, sometimes it's just a matter of setting priorities. But in any case, budget is definitely something to think about. If you have that 50 by 100 foot train room, and you also have all the time in the world, but you don't have any money, again, maybe not plan on building the entire thing at once. Do it over time and do it in sections or, in little chunks or something so that it becomes more manageable. So the last thing in terms of practicalities that I want to talk about in this episode is your skill level. And unlike space, time, and budget, your skill level is something you can improve. It can be really hard to get more space unless you add on to your house or can move to a new house that has more room. It can be hard to rearrange your life to carve out some more time for your hobby. And if it was easy to get more money, we'd all be rich, right? But skills can be improved with practice. So basically, the more model railroading you do, the better you'll get at it. So, if you're worried about your skill level, just start doing things. One of the things you can do if you're worried about your skills in building a layout is to start off small. Build a small layout, whether it's a small standalone layout or a section of something bigger that you're going to add on to later. Start small. So this is a good example of doing something small to kind of get your feet wet. This is a little 2-foot by 5-foot module that I built back when I was living in a condo. And I'd had plans originally to build 2 of them, but I could never fit the second one, so I didn't complete it. But this is where I take all my review photos. And what's cool about this is even though it's small, it's just got 2 mainline tracks, a crossover, and a spur and another spur. But everything works. The turnouts have under-the-table switch machines that are controlled with a control panel. I've got a DCC hookup for my Digitrax throttles. And if I cleaned up the track and hooked up the power, I could run trains on this. Can't do a lot with them because it's so small, but I could run stuff. So doing something like this is a way to get experience with every aspect of the hobby: the bench work, track laying, wiring, scenery, the whole everything. Even building a structure kit or two. One of the things I like about this is this bridge over here. It's an SP design bridge that I scratch built following some plans that were in an issue of Mainline Modeler many, many years ago. I'm thinking that I might, when I start to build the big layout, I might cannibalize this thing and probably take this bridge and reuse it somewhere. Don't really think I'll need to keep this little module, once I get the big layout kind of going, but it served its purpose, and I've gotten a lot of use out of it. And I've gotten a lot of, good practical knowledge from doing it. So it's definitely a worthwhile thing to, build something small first and get your skills up. And then, as you go along, you can build more. And then, if your skills improve to the point where, the first section that you build doesn't look as good as the 5th one, then you can go back and, fix up the first one, and then have a really nice layout. So to recap, when it comes to choosing what to model, so far we've talked about figuring out your likes and dislikes, thinking about how accurate you want to be, and considering your space, time, budget, and skill level. Anyway, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I want to do with the room back here. And it's taken me a long time to kind of figure that out. And it was not an easy thing to figure out. I really had to give it a lot of thought. And I remember reading articles by, John Armstrong, the famous track planner, about givens and druthers and things like that, which is basically your list of things you must have and things that you would like to have. Things that I would like to have would be like Santa Fe SP, stuff that I can use all my equipment that I've been modeling for all these years. But one of the things that really kind of fell on the must-have list, and this may surprise some people, but is Amtrak. I really, really want to have an Amtrak long-distance train on my layout. And, I've lived in California my whole life, so my layout is going to be mostly based in California. And that limits the number of long-distance trains, because there aren't really that many. that run in California, and especially if I'm going to confine myself to the northern part of the state, which is where I live. I've been to LA and this, San Diego and the south part of the state many times, but I kind of gravitate toward the north just because that's where I've lived and that's what I'm most familiar with. So I really wanted to have Amtrak, and if I'm going to do Amtrak in Northern California, there's really only two trains, the long distance trains. There's the Starlight and the Zephyr. That's pretty much it. So besides Amtrak, my other main must-haves are the layout has to be designed for photography, and it needs to model a Southern Pacific route primarily in Northern California. Things that would be nice to have include mountains, because I like mountains, a double-track main with continuous running so that the layout can be left unattended for open houses or visitors, and enough staging for all or most of my equipment. That last one might be a tall order, but we'll see. I grew up in the San Francisco area on the peninsula. I used to see the, SP commute trains before it was Caltrain going up and down the line all the time. My maternal grandfather used to ride those commute trains to work back in the 70s. From my grandmother's deck, my dad's mom, back before there was so much development and before the trees got so high, you could stand on her deck or in her living room because she had these big picture windows, and you could look down and see the SP commute line through Belmont, which is the town that I lived in. And I would stand out there or stand at the window every time I heard a horn and watch the trains go through. Also, my parents over the years had a couple different cabins up near Donner. So we would go up there and I'd see the trains going over Donner Pass. Sometimes we went up to Shasta and I would see the trains there. So it was always SP territory. I didn't really see a lot of Santa Fe growing up. I had one uncle that lived in Los Angeles, and a couple of times as we were visiting him, I would catch glimpses of Santa Fe stuff from the car window as we were driving somewhere. But never really saw a lot of that until I was maybe a little older. My interest in Santa Fe didn't actually really develop until the 80s when everybody thought SP was going to merge with Santa Fe. So I started getting interested in Santa Fe and this is a cool railroad too, and then of course that didn't happen. But I kept the interest. But anyway, one of the obvious choices if you want to run SP in Santa Fe would be Tehachapi. But I didn't really want to do Tehachapi because there's no Amtrak train on Tehachapi, unless once in a while the Coast Starlight will, detour over Tehachapi, but it's not a normal thing. Having visited the La Mesa Club in San Diego and seeing their huge Tehachapi loop, which is done to about 80 or 90% of true scale, so it's enormous. I really couldn't see doing like a dinky version of the loop because I think it would look kind of silly. And I didn't want to do something that big because even in a room like this, it would take up the whole room. I don't know what the scenery depth of that scene that they have there is, but it's not something you can reach across. They actually built their benchwork robust enough that they can walk on it, and that's how they get in there. So it's huge. So I kind of ruled Tehachapi out early. So anyway, getting back to Northern California, and the two Amtrak trains that I basically have to use. The Coast Starlight runs on the coastline, which is beautiful, runs along, all the way from LA up to Oakland, along the California coast. And especially in the southern part, there's some really gorgeous stretches where it's kind of right on the water. Some big trestles down there, which are really cool. And I've done some rail fanning in that area, and it's, that would be a really neat line to model. There's the Cal P line, which runs along, the Sacramento River Delta and along, parts of the bay. And on that line, you've got double track SP, and you do actually have the Santa Fe kind of close there. And I've done some rail fanning in Pinole, and the former SP tracks, which is now Union Pacific, are by the water, and then up on a bluff, almost within spitting distance, is the BNSF line, which was, of course, Santa Fe. And so you could actually, if you modeled that area, you could get both of them in close proximity. And then, of course, there's, that extends like through Sacramento, and then there's the the Shasta route, which is, of course, an awesome line to model as well. One of the things that would be cool about that one is, like Dunsmuir as a yard is fairly small. It's not like Roseville, say, which is many miles long. It's a little bit smaller, something you could fit into a model railroad a little easier. And it's a single track line with lots of passing sidings, so that would be an interesting thing. There's also interchange with the McLeod River Railroad, which is cool, and also via the former SP Siskiyou line, which is became Corp, I think, in 1995, if I remember. Also the Wairika Western. So you've got, you could basically work in interchanges with, basically a regional and two short lines doing that, depending on which year you're setting it in. So that would be really cool. But, if I really had to think about it, though, I really started to remember all of the family trips that we took up to Donner and going through Truckee. And we'd be up there and I'd see a headlight in the distance and I'd, beg my dad so we could hang around so I could see the train come through town. I remember one time we stayed in the Truckee Hotel, which is right there kind of on the main drag. And I didn't have a camera, but I was standing out on the balcony trying to write down all the engine numbers that I saw as the SP trains came through. And unfortunately, I don't have that piece of paper anymore. I wish I did. I can remember going on fishing trips with my uncles, and there was this one spot that we went down under this bridge, and on the other side of the river, the SP tracks were up on the bluff. So I've decided that I'm modeling Donner Pass. And the portion of Donner Pass that I want to model is actually, I originally thought that I was going to try to model from Roseville to Truckee, but Roseville Yard is, I think, something on the order of 4 or 5 miles long. Even modeling a portion of that would be a daunting task for the amount of space even that I have. And also, given that I have those 2 scale miles, and it's actually less than that if you count that one whole wall would probably be taken up by Roseville. The running room between Roseville and Truckee wouldn't actually be all that long, and that seemed kind of funky. So I thought, I haven't seen a lot of people model the eastern part of the line. So I kind of changed my thinking, and I started getting interested in Sparks, Nevada. And actually the yard at Sparks is kind of cool because it's a little smaller, a little more modelable, and it also has all these industries around it, which is kind of unusual and neat. Well, I don't know how unusual it is, but I thought it was pretty neat because I haven't seen a lot of yards that have all these like industrial tracks kind of radiating out around them. So I'm thinking to myself that that would be really interesting to operate. So I think what I want to do is probably going to build a double deck layout, but the main deck is going to be the top deck and the lower level is going to be mostly staging. And on the top deck, using those couple of miles, it'll start basically at the summit at Norden because SP had this really neat covered turntable thing there. I want to model that. The real one was out of service, I think, in the 80s and ripped out in like 92 or 93, but I'm just going to model it probably, as if it were still there. There's the scene with the snow sheds at China Wall overlooking Donner Lake, which I really like. That track was ripped out, I think, in 1993, but I'm going to model it as if it was still there. And then Truckee, I want to model Truckee, and I think I can probably do the commercial row of Truckee, the downtown part, fairly to scale with not a lot of compression. And then I want to have a lot of open running through the Truckee River Canyon, so there won't be much, but it'll just be mostly scenery in that area. And then there's a little, if I can work it in kind of on the, probably end up on the back wall, there's a little tiny industrial switching area kind of on the outskirts of Reno that I might try to work in and maybe enhance it with a few more industries than are actually there. And then going into the yard at Sparks. And then it, at both ends of the layout, because I don't want any duck unders or anything, there will be a pair of helixes on either end that go down to the staging level. So that's kind of where the plan is right now. I haven't really drawn it out in detail, it's still mostly up here. But I think it should work pretty well, and I think it's going to be pretty cool. And I realize that kind of leaves the Santa Fe out in the cold, but one of the main goals for me, being that I'm doing this YouTube channel and I like to take pictures, is that the railroad has to be photo friendly and has to be video friendly. And that has a lot of ramifications in terms of like lighting and the design of the aisleways and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of things that go along with making it photo friendly. But one of the things that I've always been thinking is that there should be parts of the layout that will be sort of generic enough that I could photograph other equipment that's maybe out of era or even out of location. For example, in the Truckee River Canyon area, I could put modern Union Pacific Gevos and SD70 Aces and take a shot that was set in the present day, and it would look just fine. Union Pacific uses that line all the time. After all, it's their track now, right? And then I thought, Santa Fe, wouldn't look too bad running through the Nevada desert because, Santa Fe runs through deserts a lot and, through Arizona and New Mexico. And I realized that the scenery in Arizona and New Mexico is not exactly like Nevada, but, for photography purposes, I think I could make it work. And, you can't have everything. So, I eventually it comes down to picking something. And so that's what I decided to do. And of course, I can always use my Santa Fe engines as pool power. I realize SP and Santa Fe didn't pool stuff as much as some other railroads, but modeler's license, a little bit of that freelance thrown in, and I think it'll work. And then there's this. So I apologize for the quality of this video. This was back before I knew about tripods. This was actually taken in Truckee in 1998. And yes, granted, technically this is a BNSF train, but hey, a little artistic license, and I think it could work. So those are my thoughts on how to figure out what to model. It's not always an easy decision, and sometimes you can't have every single thing that you want. But the idea is to try to get enough of what you want that you build something that you're happy with and that will last a long time. Because let's face it, building a model railroad is something that typically takes a long time to do. And I'm not the kind of person that wants to, rip it out the second I finish it and do something completely different. I plan to keep this. So, I don't know about anybody else, but I want to build it once and then be done. There's a lot of stuff to think about. There's no right or wrong answers. It's just a matter of trying to figure out what works best for you and what makes you happy. In the future, I'm going to do more of these episodes. This is going to be another one of those series that kind of comes out sporadically, kind of like the SP Consist build. I don't have any kind of regular schedule plan for it. It's going to be, as I have something to show, I'll put out another episode. The next thing I have to do, well, two things really. One, I have to do a more detailed track plan for the room. So I'll be talking about track planning in upcoming episodes. And also have to do some more room prep, because I don't want to have bare studs. I would like to have a more finished looking room. So that's going to probably be an episode in itself. And then, as we go down the road, there'll be more hands-on stuff, building bench work, laying track, all that kind of thing. And also, like I hinted at in the beginning, maybe a side project or two, which I hope will be fun. So, stay tuned. And thanks everybody for watching and finding the channel, and I hope you enjoyed it.